Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations for today's Q&A special, where we will be delving into your questions, both questions that you have sent in the live chat from the past. So as we say all the time, we do hang on to those questions and we will deal with them in the Q&A specials that we have every 6 to 8 weeks or so. So we've got some of those questions. We have got one or two questions which have come into creation research as a whole, because we have things that come in via the Ask site, and there's one question that we'll bring up a little bit later, which we will deal with in a full article on the Q&A site at some point in the future, but it's worth delving into a little bit today. And of course, we take live questions from yourself in the live chat as we go. So Sam is now on standby, ready to take your questions. So remember, you just put the capital Q, then your question. It makes it easier for Sam to pick them out so that he can bring them to us a little bit later. So yes, do continue to get your questions in. Thank you very much for everybody who has joined us watching already. Now, we're going to start things today with a brief little report from Diane, because a big part of the work that Creation Research does is not only the questions and answers, right, on the Q&A site, but also the newsletters where we go through the scientific literature looking for both evidence, but also an explanation for some of the so-called evidence for evolution that is often reported on, and it goes together in our evidence news. And we recently had one of these evidences news released, so Diane's going to do a brief little report on that. We've got a little comment from John, and then really we're just going to dive into questions as we go through this program for the next hour and a half or so. So we are joined by the full team. We've obviously got Dr. Glenn Wilson, John Mackay, Dr. Diane Eager, Craig Hawkins, and Sam is keeping an eye on things in the chat. So it's good to see you all, and thank you for all those who are in the chat already. Diane, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we've sent out a newsletter this week, which if you're on our mailing list, you should have got. If you're not on our mailing list, it is free. You can sign up for it on our main website. Maybe we can put that in the in the chat or in the comments somewhere. But this week we have a few interesting things. We always have some encouraging ministry news about what's happening, and there's been all sorts of wonderful things happening. Joseph and Glenn have been out looking at the polystrate trees and looking at all sorts of other interesting things as well. So we've got a bit about that, and we've got a bit about people who have visited the museum in Tasmania and the museum in Brisbane. So it's always good to be encouraged by what's happening out there in the world. And then we have various bits and pieces that we get from the scientific news, which is usually presented in the mainstream media as being evidence for evolution. And here is an article about genuine change in bacteria, because we all carry around a lot of bacteria in our digestive systems and on our other body surfaces as well. Now, most of these don't cause us any harm. In fact, they're good for us, and they are now called the microbiome, and they are an important part of our biology. But it turns out that some of these, and we've known about this for a while, if they get into the wrong place, they can make you extremely ill. So scientists have decided, well, what's the difference between the ones that make you seriously ill and the ones that behave themselves and stay in their place? And it turns out that for one species of bacteria called E. coli, the difference is that the disease-causing ones have a broken gene. They can't make a substance called cellulose, which we think of as being part of plants, but other living things do make it. And in fact, one of the scientists who did this study summed it up beautifully. The good bacteria make it and the bad bacteria don't. Now, that changes the surface properties of the bacteria, and so that's why they can cause disease. So do have a look at that for all of the details. We archive all of these items on our fact file. That's a separate website. It has a link to it from our main website, but you can just go to it, creation file, um, and you'll find all of these archived individual items. You don't need to know when they were sent out in which particular newsletter, and you can do a topical search to find them. And then we had a story about silk. Now, did you know that silk is made by all sorts of other creatures besides silkworms, including these little prawn-like creatures called amphipods that live in the sea? And some biologists decided, well, we try and fit this into an evolutionary tree. And this usually ends up being a fool's errand, trying to fit things into evolutionary tree. And exactly, it certainly was in this case. How do we explain how these amphipods that live in the sea and silkworms and various other insects, how did they get all of the right genes for making silk? And in a throwaway line, one of the biologists who was involved in this study said, well, trying to work this out and find a common ancestor between amphipods and silkworms, that's what keeps me up at night. Well, we have an instant cure for that sort of insomnia. Forget about evolutionary trees. Go back to what it says in the scriptures, that God made everything according to their kinds. And of course, being the designer of the different kinds, he would have given them all the appropriate genes for functions that he wants them to have. So you can read some more details about this. Now, how valuable are you compared to snails? Some conservation scientists did a study in Australia asking people what would they give priority to saving in the case of a bushfire or a wildfire? If you only had one opportunity to save either people, animals, or buildings, and naturally enough, people went for saving people. But in this list of options that was given to them as to which would you give the most priority to and which the least, one of the options was a group of snails that if they got wiped out, that means that species would be wiped off the planet or would be extinct. And sure enough, people said that they would give saving people the highest priority. That's not surprising. But the snail ended up getting the snail species ended up getting a real thumbs down. It ended up with a negative score in the way that they scored the results of this survey. And the conservation scientists who wrote this article said, well, this is fascinating and troubling that people valued human life more than the extinction of entire non-human species. Interesting, isn't it, that if you have an evolutionary mindset, basically human beings are just one blob of cells and snails are another blob of cells. And how do you decide what has more value? It's only if you look at human beings and other living things from a biblical point of view that you get to know their value, because ultimately the value of things is determined by its creator. So in the Bible, there is a statement from Jesus that we are worth many sparrows. Well, Australians will agree with that, and we also happen to be worth many snails. So have a look at the details for that. And if we can come back to us now, I think John has some interesting things to share as well.
Just to add on to a quick comment there, Diane, one of the presentations we do at Creation Research, which we should probably get back to doing at some point, is, or do again on Creation Conversations at some point, is a sort of an animal rights program, right? And talking about animal rights. And I've sort of stolen that little report from you there to add into my presentation, because what I like to start with is a series of examples of animal rights conservationists that try and make, quite frankly, ridiculous claims. One of them claimed that humans should be willing to donate their blood to mosquitoes because they have just as much right to live as we do. There are others that said that they had to separate hens and cockerels from a chicken farm, because the cockerels never ask the hens' consent before mating with them, and and you sort of, and you sort of end up devolving into lunacy very, very quickly. So you're absolutely right. We need to get back to a biblical point of view. So great stuff. John, yes, you've got a brief little report / advert, and then we'll throw it over into questions.
Right, give me the screen, please, Sam. Thank you. And welcome to a beautiful morning here in Queensland, Australia. And it's hot in other places. It's supposed to be the hottest in Tasmania and places like that since 1942. Yes, they've had this hot before. So don't be fooled by some of the rubbish reports you get on climate change and things like that. History is a good reference point to nonsense that's said in the present. Okay, that was just an unexpected aside because the sun just came out and it's just so beautiful out here today. 8:30 this morning, I've got a team of guys coming. You can praise the Lord for these volunteers because on Wednesday, we're having our house demolded. Why are we doing that? Well, it's been discovered that mold is a major contributor to problems such as dementia, which my wife has. So we're forking out a few thousand to actually get the mold guys in. We've got to clean out the house. We've got to shift the cupboards away from the walls. We've got to do, it's unbelievable how much junk you can store in a house after being here for 47 years. But praise the Lord for the group of guys who are coming. And praise the Lord too for that little research report Diane had on bacteria. Because one of the other things we're looking at is the influence of probiotics. I've said this before, and they've been a real help to my wife in stabilizing her mental condition. Some of you may remember I reported as of the middle of December, she started to get her smell back for the first time in 7 years. And now she can enjoy my cooking because she can smell it. As Diane will happily tell you, God has made us so that our basic tastes are just salt and sour and bitter and sweet, but the rest of it is smell. And many people who have dementia sort of give up eating because they can't taste anything that's worth eating about. But praise the Lord, we've managed to see that change come back with my darling wife, Anne. So continue to pray for her. Pray for us for a very busy morning. And also pray for, you got your pencils, you got your pens, you got your paper, April 20th and 21st. We are putting on our first big seminar of the year, which deals with, well, it's really a question that an Estonian asked recently in our museum. Where do the Aboriginals come from? Where do the Australian Indigenous people come from? Are they all one group? How long have they been here? We'll be dealing at our conference on the 20th and the 21st with the origin of the Australian Aborigines. And we'll even have people like our artist, Steve Cardno, who's got one question about this on our website, the QnA website, because he's been dealing with paints and pigments for, well, all his adult life. He still does our beautiful murals. He's currently in the middle of a big new mural on the origin of Australian Aborigines, on boomerangs and things like that. So 20th, 21st, come along and hear Steve, come along and hear Diane, come along and hear me. We may be even sneak in Craig. We're not quite sure about that yet. And Dr. John Osgood, who's one of our behind-the-scenes experts on the history of various racial groups. So that's 20th and 21st, the Australian Aborigines. Whose country is it? Where did they come from? Is it India? How did they get from Babel to India in the first place? So all sorts of interesting topics. Go to the website, read Steve's current article on paint and Aboriginal races and cave art, etc. It's really worth looking at. In fact, Diane, I'll get you to remind them how they get to the website. And Sam, if you'll put up how to get to our QnA website, that'll be helpful too. But that's me, 20th, 21st of April. That's roughly sort of 4.5 weeks away. Note it down and we'll give you more details as it gets closer. Here on the western side of Brisbane, you will have a great 2 days. Back to you, guys.
Thank you very much for that, John. And yes, remember the websites that you can check out, askjohnmackay.com and creationresearch.com. Very briefly, just from me, we've been all over again since last week, including up to a rather large boat in Kentucky.
We did see a big boat.
We went up to the Answers in Genesis site and museum and got to meet with some of their scientists up there, which was very productive. So we praise the Lord for that. And we're back on the road here in the United States, in Tennessee, and I will be preaching again for a whole day on Sunday. So do keep my the last 2 weeks of ministry in prayer. We're here for less than 2 weeks, and we've still got 5 engagements to fill up, as well as a couple of research trips we want to do as well. So do keep us in prayer as we continue and continue to pray for my wife as well back at home, who is now over 4 months pregnant. So just pray for protection for her. Right, we're going to throw it over to questions now, which means that Sam takes charge once again. And Sam, why don't we start with, we had a question that came in to our main site, our main Ask site, a couple of days ago, which we'll eventually go on to produce a full-sized answer and article for. But over to you to introduce that question, and we'll then go around the team.
All right, so this question came in to our Ask site from Quentin Hobbs. Question, what do we say to people who bring up the flood stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, who experts say is 1,000 years older than the Genesis flood story?
Okay, I'll kick this one off. I remember 2 professors who've been very influential in this. One was a professor of ancient Middle Eastern semantics and Semitics in Sydney University. And he basically struggled with the biblical story, the biblical account, the biblical history, etc. And he said, well, we've got records from Babylon that are so old we can't fit the biblical record into that. And I said, well, hang on. What is your record in Babylon based upon? Because the Enuma Elish and all of these other Gilgamesh epics sort of trace back to secular history, not this story, but the dating of them. Okay, you may remember your biblical account, Adam to Noah, 10 generations, and then Noah and the flood, and then Babel, etc., and then Babel, Babylon, all of those Middle Eastern kingdoms. And what the question is all about is, well, if they had a Noah's flood story before the biblical record, then it must have occurred before that. Now, taking the Bible at face value, the Bible says Noah's flood was the first one, regardless of when your record comes from, and Babel, etc., are post-flood, post-Babel records written in recollection or written in rebellion, take your pick. Now, I remember asking this professor, I said, now, when you date your Middle Eastern records, how do you do it? He said, well, we have a record of the sun rising in Egypt, one account. And he said, if you work backwards with the sunrise, the moonrise, etc., from the present day, wind the clock backwards, which is fairly easy to do on a computer, you end up with a date which precedes the biblical record of Noah, etc. I said, now stop a moment. Aren't you assuming that the sun and the moon and the stars have always been in the same place relative to where they are now? He said, yes. I said, tell me, if I suggested that the earth had been tilted, what would that do to your assumption? He said it would throw it right out. Now, I'm not the first to notice this, because the man who noticed this and put it into history was the guy who was made to check Einstein's calculations in the beginning in South Australia. You need to check up some of these, because he noticed one thing. The ancient Babylon, the ancient pyramids in Egypt, the solar pyramids, the solar temples rather, their aisle, the older they got, the further away they were from the summer solstice. Now, his conclusion was simple. Either Egypt has shifted, the world has shifted, or the sun has shifted. Either way, you end up with a dating problem for the current state of the background to this question. If you change the angle of the solar temples. If you shift the summer solstice, then the dates that the question is based on are absolutely corrupt. Then I asked the professor another question. I said, could you fit all of biblical history into everything known in the Middle East? And could you fit all the Middle Eastern history into the biblical record? His answer was absolutely enlightening. He said, yes, but we don't want to. Now, that is quote unquote. I could not believe he'd be that blunt with me. In other words, sure, we know there's a contradiction, but we will accept the secular history rather than the biblical one. Why? Scientific reason? No. Why? Historic reason? No. The only reason was we don't want to. Now, that's what I'd encourage you to realize, that all of these questions are actually have a basis in assumptive history, not real history. Okay, the second one is Dr. Clifford Wilson. Now, can I encourage you, as a man, Clifford Wilson was a wonderful blessing to people like me. Not only did he run the Biblical Archaeology Society in Australia, he had been a lecturer in Monash University, one of our more prestigious places, and he also got involved in archaeology in the field. And he wrote several books, particularly on the ancient Middle Eastern records, and he noted one thing. The oldest written records are the ones that don't come from Babylon. They come from over in the section just south of where your biblical people, Moses, etc., are recorded. So look up Dr. Clifford Wilson, look up his comments on Enuma Elish or Gilgamesh, look up all of those things, and you'll get an absolutely different view. The question is a good question, but based on a bad, wrong, false bit of data. That's how you have to deal with it in thoroughness. So that's the Professor of Ancient Middle Eastern Semitics in Sydney, as well as Dr. Clifford Wilson, and you will find those useful resources. Anybody else got a comment they want to put in?
Sure. So aside from the dating, right, the 1,000 years older, the other claim is that, well, why is it a problem if it's 1,000 years older? Well, the claim then is that the Israelites copied the Epic of Gilgamesh when they were in captivity in Babylon and effectively wrote it into Genesis, right, which is where the record of the biblical flood comes from. The problem with that comes is that, as John pointed out, and in fact, even as the question points out, there are more stories of a global flood than there is just in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Many of them are claimed to have predated even the Epic of Gilgamesh. Case in point, the Sumerian king list. So this is going to be one of the earlier civilizations post-Babel, right? They have a documentation where they believe in a supernatural creation. They believe in 10 pre-flood kings, just like you have 10 pre-flood patriarchs in the book of Genesis, and they believe in a global flood that wiped out the whole world. Now, does that mean that the Epic of Gilgamesh people, the Babylonians, did they steal it off the Sumerians? Because they were a slightly different people group. Well, then you realize that actually you have independent records, not only in the Middle East, but also around the world of a global flood. And what you come to the realization is maybe this isn't they're copying each other. Perhaps the more likeliest explanation is that a supernatural creation and a global flood actually happened. And what we're actually dealing with are various different renditions, many of which have been converted into mythology, because that's what happens to stories in cultures over time. They get added to them, stories get twisted, languages get changed, and so on and so forth. And you end up with various renditions of a real account, but they are all slightly different. So your Babylonian epic is slightly different from your Sumerian epic, which is slightly different from your Indus Valley epic, which is slightly different, and so on and so forth. The difference between all of these is that these stories have all become effectively mythology, right? They are impossible because they have, depictions of an ark, which is a complete cube. They have depictions or a canoe or riding on the back of a turtle or so on and so forth, right? So we've really entered the fairy tale land, right? Once upon a time. Now compare that with the biblical record, because the biblical record has some rather interesting things in it. Number one, it carries specifics, right? On the 600th year, on the so on and so forth, 17th day of the month, the windows of heaven opened. right? So it records a specific time. It's not a once upon a time. You also have specifics in the arc
Dimensions.
design as well, right? In your qubits, which we know are now the best dimensions to be used for, effectively a barge, which is going to sit on the water, as opposed to something like a cube. So when you actually compare the fact that all of these are ancient records, all of these are ancient records of the same event, many of them have fallen into mythology. Which is the one that's the most accurate? The Bible is. But it shouldn't be surprised, because the Bible is the inspired word of God, and we're told over and over again in the scriptures that God's word will endure forever. It will actually be preserved and it will last. We're also told that God's word is true from the very beginning. So yes, challenge the dating, so to speak, but also challenge the fact that all these stories tell us is that all ancient cultures believe that these were real events that really happened in the past. Any other comments from the team?
Yeah, I just like to add a couple of things. Josephus, over 2,000 years ago, said that all the writers of antiquities, and he included the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Chaldeans, all recorded that their ancestors lived 1,000 years, which ties into the biblical account of long ages, of course. And in the Babylonian stories, there's a lot of connections. So there is some realities that are definitely recorded there. For example, some of the people like the king Enmerkar. Now, it's been pointed out by some scholars that Enmerkar is quite likely Nimrod, who's mentioned in the Bible. The Kar means hunter, or the hunter, and then you get the Enmar. You take, because Hebrew takes out the vowels, you're left with NMR, and that can be retranslated as Nimri the hunter, which is Nimrod the hunter, mentioned in the Bible. Same person, most likely, and you can point this out with others there as well, and even Noah. So I'm in agreement with you, Joe, and John, obviously, that the biblical account is most likely something that's been recorded and then rewritten by Moses. There's been other accounts that he's relied on, probably directly from those who are involved.
I will add one more comment, because I've just had a chance to take a couple of minutes to look it up. Dr. Clifford Wilson's work that he donated to us is dealing with legends that predate the Gilgamesh, is the Ebla tablets, right? So if you want to have a look at the translation of the Ebla tablets by a non-Christian author, but commented on by Dr. Clifford Wilson, who was, as I said, Monash University, and ran the Biblical Archaeological Society, and a great supporter of our ministry. The Ebla tablets is what you want to go looking for if you want a record of a flood which almost matches your biblical record, and it's from just outside of the traditional area of origin of Moses and places like that.
Good stuff. Right. All right, Sam, why don't we have a question from the live chat, because I think we've seen a few questions come in, then we'll carry on.
All right. Well, because Sandy asked so nicely, I'll ask Sandy's question first. Question: is Tiktaalik good evidence for a transitional fossil? Evolutionists say it was predicted.
Well, it's interesting, because this was almost exactly the question that we had the other night on the Standing for Truth channel when we were debating it. And the question is, are these transitional forms in the first place? And secondly, is it predicted? And it ultimately comes down to the way that you interpret things. If you know that something needs to exist, then you're going to start interpreting things that you find in that light. But John, do you want to have a comment?
Yes, we got Ian Juby, who'd been to see the stuff, and myself to edit it. There's an article on our QnA website on exactly that Tiktaalik, right? Now, again, there's two sections of this. One is, how do you decide when something's intermediate? Because having been involved in education much of my life, I always remember your first lessons in classification, where they start with round objects, square objects, oblong objects, triangular objects, and they get you to arrange them in some sort of hierarchy to end up with round buttons. Now, you will end up with sort of a system of squares, diamond shapes, elongates. Finally, you'll end up with round buttons. And you could say, well, I'll predict there'll be another shape here and there. Now, predicting the other shape, you have to realize is a result of what you think goes in all of those shapes. Now, to call the shape you end up with intermediate is a consequence of your view, not a consequence of reality. Now, when you have a look at the classification system, I repeat what I said on the show the other night, Dr. Stephen Gould's problem. Remember Stephen Gould with the monster theory? The reason he came up with that sort of sudden appearance of monsters, etc., was that his comment is the actual evidence fits the biblical record far better. Right? It fits the biblical classification system far better. Look up classification on our QnA website. Look up intermediates on our QnA website if you want some of these quotes. And he was the most reliable guy because he told you what the evidence was, even though he had some of the weirdest interpretation you could ever imagine. He knew the difference between his facts and what he was trying to say with them, hence his compliment to creationists. The creation system, a classification of separate kinds, is far closer to the evidence than the evolutionist ordinary one. Hence, we need a new interpretation. He didn't want creation. He didn't want after their kinds. He knew what the data was, supported after their kinds. So he came up with this fantastic sudden appearance, right? And of course, it's proved to be absolute nonsense. But he at least knew the difference between the buttons and the interpretation where to put a new button that you've just designed. So that's probably the most useful comment that came both out of the question answer show we had on Open Channel with Donnie rather, the other day, Standing for Truth. I believe that's still available if you folks want to go look at it. Sam can put up a link for you if you like. But that's the best way of dealing with things like Tiktaalik. Go to the Q&A, look up Tiktaalik. Look up Ian Juby's answer. He did a great job in the original research and checking it out. I've been to see the various Tiktaalik models as well as some of the original type stuff they've dug up. So that's probably enough from me, Joe.
Yeah, it's also just briefly worth pointing out that if you look at other examples of fossils that have been attempted to be fitted into evolutionary history, case in point, the coelacanth, which was supposed to be the sort of predecessor to the Tiktaalik in the sense that it's a fish with short, stumpy legs or short, stumpy fins that are supposed to have been evolving into legs because they're hard, short, stumpy, bony fins. And we only knew about them from the fossils. And so the argument was this is a fish on the way to evolving legs. Then comes Tiktaalik, which is almost evolving legs, and then you finally get these creatures which get out and walk on the land. And in a museum wall display, that looks like a pretty nice even sequence from fish to amphibian, or fish to kind of semi-land creature. Problem, of course, is we found coelacanth. It's regarded as a living fossil. It's a deep sea fish. It's nowhere near close to the land, even if you wanted to get out and walk on it. And its fins are, guess what? Fins, right? They don't actually use it for legs or anything like that. So you've still got a good example that the creature is still a fish and isn't on its way to evolving into anything because it's still alive today, right? If it was trying to evolve into anything, it's stuck in a rut and found a dead end. So what it has done, however, is reproduce after its own kind. Now you find that you can fit Tiktaalik perfectly into that biblical interpretation of after its kind because it lived as it was until it went extinct. As far as we know, there's no indication that it evolved into anything else at all. All right, great stuff. Let's have one more question then, Sam, and then we'll have a reminder about the things that are coming up in creation research and some of the things that we've been doing. So over to you.
All right, then. So let's do... this question comes in from Douglas Boffey. Question, doesn't dendrochronology, I hope I'm doing that right, contradict the biblical timeline?
No. Quite frankly, no. Many of the oldest trees...
What is dendrochronology, first of
It's
all?
the aging of the trees. And many of the oldest trees that go beyond the flood, or actually it's very questionable as to how they're aged because there'll be multiple trunks tied together. And so it's not like we think of as a tree and you take a boring and then you count the rings. It gets much more complicated when you've got multiple trunks, some of them that are incomplete, and then they infer an age of the missing parts. So, no, if you look at, now I can't remember the scientist that is a forester that looked into this. And once you get on out there to the 4 to 6,000, they get just very questionable as to how they went about aging these.
Now, the other point, which if you go and watch the debate which John had with Richard Dawkins, you'll find Richard Dawkins making the point that although dendrochronology on its own doesn't necessarily contradict the biblical timeline, his claim was that you could match dendrochronology up with carbon-14 up with so-and-so up with radiometric dating, and therefore you get your age of 1 million years. Now, there's lots and lots of problems with that because, quite frankly, they don't overlap, and you can go to the QnA site and find out more about carbon-14 dating. But the point which John brought out, and the point that is so vital to understand, is that whenever you get any form of dating method like this, I mean, what does dendrochronology do? Dendrochronology measures the tree rings, right? Okay, so you come to somewhere like the UK and you look at the Old English oak and it has 1 ring a year. And the reason why is because we have only one growing period a year. Now, you go to somewhere like Tasmania, and Craig can comment on this, you can get multiple rings a year if the conditions are right. So what it tells you is that the present is not necessarily the key to the past. And that's the point that John had to make to Richard Dawkins. It's the point that we make in almost all of our presentations, and that is if you take the faulty assumption that the present is the key to the past, then you will find that there are contradictions with almost every dating method and the biblical record. Quite simply because the Bible does not teach that the present is the key to the past, but the past is the key to the present. Now, the present is the key to the past as a concept, uniformitarianism, right, introduced it's not a new idea at all, introduced in ancient history, but really popularized by James Hutton and then later Charles Lyell for the sole purpose of getting people to reject God. They openly admitted that was their agenda, right, to free science from Moses. So if you're going to start with a concept which is anti-biblical at its heart, don't be surprised when things like dendrochronology have the appearance, and carbon-14 and radiometric dating and all the rest of it, don't be surprised when they have the appearance of contradicting the biblical timeline, because they have started with faulty assumptions. Now, if you start with that, you're going to find contradictions. If you think about it the other way around and go, okay, well, look at the fact that the present isn't the key to the past. We have different locations where you can get a whole mess of tree rings depending on the environment, right? Any comments, John or Craig, from that?
Craig, you want to go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just unmute my mic. A couple of things. Glenn's exactly right when he says that what they try and do with dendrochronology is match up tree rings even in fossils. So they count back, get to a particular scar, for example, or a particular mark on the tree ring and say, well, that was an event like a fire or something that damaged that tree. And then they get another fossil and try and line that event up. And then count back from there. And that's the reason they get extended years, is because they're assuming which years line up in those events that they've sort of looked at on those particular fossils. But so there's a lot of guesswork involved in that. But in Tassie, we've got the Huon pine, and the Huon pine is a tree. It's only found in Tasmania. It's got no known borers or things that will get into the wood and kill it. It's used for boat building. We actually get shavings of it and put it into our wardrobe so that the insects don't come into your wardrobe and eat your socks and things. And there's a clonal stand over on the west coast of Tasmania that's meant to be over 10,000 years old, because it can clone. It can shoot up from roots and so on. But the individual trees that they've got in that, they estimated as being no older than 2,000 to 3,000 years.
Yes.
So again, it's assumptions about the cloning and how long the the stand has been there and cloned into these individual trees. So it doesn't contradict the biblical timeline at all if you take your assumptions out.
Mm-hmm.
Give me the screen, Sam, and I'll talk about Washington State. Some of you may know the name Weyerhaeuser. They have been a huge corporation dealing with paper products and things like that in the USA. I personally got to know David Weyerhaeuser, and he was the guy who, well, as the person who introduced me said, him and the family own all the trees from here to Alaska, and God, they share them. So it was a really interesting guy to meet. But I was there studying Mount St. Helens, and his group deals with a lot of the forests around there. And he made several comments, one of which is pertinent. He said after Mount St. Helens blew its top, because of the coating of dust on most of the trees for quite a long way, there was no new growth for some 7 years, right? So you could count the calendar years, but you couldn't count the tree year, the ring years. They simply weren't there, no growth. Now, that wasn't surprising to me, because coming from Australia, where we'll sometimes have massive droughts, our biggest known drought is not the one that's been occurring in the last couple of years. Our biggest known drought was the Federation drought back in 1901. No rain for years and years and years. And you can see this on a fairly regular basis if you go to the desert sort of outside of Darwin, where you have massive dry seasons. And you also have sometimes 2 or 3 wet seasons in a year. So here's what you find. If you have no rain from a couple of years, no growth. You see, in England, they have regular seasons, they have regular winters, regular summers, regular tree ring growth. In Australia, no regular seasons. That's our norm, has been since it was settled by the Europeans. No regular tree rings. No rings for 7 or 8 years. Then sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 rings in 1 year, because the tree is opportunistic. It takes the opportunity to actually grow when it can. And I still remember traveling part of Western Australia with the chief forester over there, and I was asking him, okay, we're out here in the desert, there's a gum tree, how does it stay alive when that little lake that it's in is actually full of water? He said it just sort of shuts down, and then it won't regrow until after the water's gone, and then it may even stop growing when it gets too dry. And I said, well, so are you saying there'd be no record of all the years it was underwater because it had turned itself off? And basically, he didn't really want to go there, but the answer is yes. So there are quite a few circumstances where the trees won't grow rings. And that becomes significant when you have a look at the way they date them using carbon-14. And I'd encourage you, have a look at the debate I had with Richard and some of the things we had to say to him. We've got the whole BBC tape up now on our YouTube. In fact, Sam's probably a good opportunity when I'm finished to give a promote to our new creation research format that they can see all these things on, and they can join and sign up. That's a real help to us as well. But you see, there's a massive problem with carbon-14. You use the tree rings to date carbon-14, you use carbon-14 to correlate the tree rings. But yet, if you keep hunting, you'll come across a 14,000 year gap in North America. It's a problem because they're trying to figure out where the American Indians arrived and where this, what caused this mega gap that's in the chronology, or it's in the carbon-14, or it's in both. So there's all these sort of issues that don't ever make it to the popular media out there that just says carbon-14 proves tree chronology proves carbon-14, and away they go, and it's regular, just add them all up. It's not regular. The world today is different from the world that existed before Noah's flood. Build it into all your thinking. The present is not the key to the past. Praise God, he's given us a written record of real history. Start there. Yes, I'm even talking to you scientists, you creation scientists out there. Make sure you're honest about where your data is coming from the Lord God who created all things, and he has bothered to tell us the key details. Use that as your outline, not Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin, or Richard Dawkins. Sam?
Well, John, before we go to Sam, why don't you remind people about the conference that's coming up? And then, Sam, I think it's a good time to not only do some thank yous, but also to to talk about Creation Research Live. So, John, just remind people what's coming up.
Okay, current politics. Aborigines have been here 65,000 years. We saw a commercial yesterday about how they're the oldest continuous culture on the planet, all of which is used for political purposes to give them land rights and all sorts of things that politicians are actually swallowing as evidence. Well, we're running a conference April 20th, 21st here in Southeast Queensland, here in the Brisbane area, southwestern Brisbane. Details will come up if you keep watching our website, in which we've got an artist, we've got Diane, we've got me, we've got a historian, and it's a great weekend as we have a look at where did the Aborigines come from, how did they get from Babel to India, from India to here, what's the evidence, and to have a good look at some of their artwork and what they said about it 20 years ago and what's being said now for purely political purposes. April 20th and 21st, don't miss it. Keep your eyes on creationresearch.net.
Great stuff. Right. We will take a short break now. Just before we do some thank yous, I just wanted to sort of briefly mention this was mentioned last week and the week before, but for those of you who don't know, we have launched our brand new streaming service, Creation Research Live, CR Live, whatever you want to call it. This solves a number of problems that we were having, but here's some of the benefits that we have for the service. It's a monthly subscription, so it's similar to Netflix or Prime Video. You can also buy and rent content. That functionality will be coming soon in the next sort of week or so. The developers are on it. They just implement. There's been a few issues with the code on that end, so they're implementing that in the next week or so. So do stay tuned. We're gonna have exclusive content on there, exclusive content and live streams that we would never be able to do on our current platform on YouTube. So things that are a bit more controversial. Have some free content on there. We are in the process of uploading even more content on there. It is a long and tedious process to try and get everything on there, but we've got the bulk of our library on there. The only thing needs to move over now is the YouTube, and also no more adverts. So if you're sick of watching YouTube adverts, 5 adverts in a row, I think the record was 10 at one point I had. So no more annoying YouTube adverts interrupting your viewing. So some of the benefits as well. It's easy to use. It's truth-filled, family-friendly. We've got exclusive content on there, and it's available 24/7. Pricing starts at $9.99 US, £7.99, and I think it's about $14, I think. And then yearly subscription is $90 US. It's now live. So go to www.creationresearch.live and sign up. Please, I do encourage you to go and sign up and get a free account. It doesn't cost anything to get an account. It's completely free. There's no pressure to sort of sign up. There is some free content on there, so you can get a sense of what it's like. It's a really, really great way of supporting creation research, and I'm super pleased with how it's sort of turned out. So I do hope that you are enjoying it. If you have already signed up, and if you haven't, please do. If you want to keep up to date with everything creation research, please do sign up to our newsletters. As Diane mentioned earlier, you can go to linkin.bio/creation research, or if you have a fancy smartphone, you can scan it with your camera there. Scan the QR code. It'll take you to our link in bio page, where I'll have all of the relevant links where you can donate, where you can sign up to the newsletters. It's got all of our websites on there, etc., etc., etc. And that's that. So without further ado, let's do some thank yous. So the first one comes in from Douglas Boffey for 10 British buckaroos, a pair character jumping up and down and saying #1 fan. Yeah, thank you so much, Douglas. Got Stacey H coming in with 3.99 US buckaroos, a pair character exaggeratingly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. Thank you so much, Stacey. Very much appreciated. We've got another donation coming from Doki Doki, a super sticker for 5 US buckaroos, a lemon character and a baby lemon jumping in the air to do a high five. Thank you so much, Doki. And also, I've got a super sticker coming from Sandy C saying thank you for answering a question. 20 New Zealand buckaroos, a pair character, looking at himself in the mirror saying thanks for being with you, with hearts popping out of his eyes. For those of you who are not initiated, if you are new in the chat, we have to read these out because we don't get the graphics of the super stickers in our software that we use to stream to YouTube and things like that. So that's why I have to reenact it for you all in glorious high definition. We also, as well, 5 US buckaroos coming from Doki Doki Pair Character, lifting some weights, saying, "Keep it up." Thank you so much. Yes. Right. There's no other donations, I don't think. Thank you so much. Do you want to talk about anything else, or do you want to move on to other questions?
I think let's move on to some more questions.
Cool
We've
beans.
got just over half an hour before we start to wrap things up. Sorry, John, were you going to say something?
Yes, I'm just going to duck out to check on my wife. We'll be back in a few moments.
That's fine, no worries.
All right then. Okay, dokie. So let's have a look for a question. Let's do one that we've had previously, that we have in our back catalogue. Just remember, folks, if we don't answer your question live, we do save it and we do come back to it in these Q&A streams. That's what they're for. This one comes in from Doki Doki. Question. But a global flood would not be compatible with the freshwater creatures. An objection I've heard.
Okay, so again, be wary of the present is the key to the past in their present state today, where we have clear boundaries between freshwater and saltwater fish. The saltwater is very salty, and you only have saltwater fish in it. The freshwater is very fresh, and you only have freshwater fish in that as well. And so to ask the question, how would freshwater creatures survive in the saltwater of the flood, you are still applying that present is the key to the past scenario. Couple of things. Number one, remember when God created everything, everything was very good. And so you have an indication of no such thing, or certainly a lower quantity of things like erosion and so on and so forth, which is what ultimately produces salt in the sea. In other words, if you throw a global flood in the mix, one thing it's going to do is actually increase the salinity of the ocean. Now, we do have examples of fish which are able to survive both in saltwater and freshwater. Salmon is a classic example of that, right? So we know that there is possible for some fish to be able to survive under both of those conditions. Now, you also have the background of from a sort of an aquarium perspective, where I know I've been and worked with aquariums, where if you, in some species of fish, in some groups of fish, you can slowly increase the salinity and slowly decrease the salinity of freshwater or saltwater fish until you get a sort of a brackish kind of water where you can have fish that actually exist together. So what it suggests is you've actually had fish that have adapted due to a change in climate to the point where you now have a severity of difference between saltwater and freshwater fish, because you have these distinguishable areas. Saltwater is now very salty and only has saltwater fish. Freshwater is very fresh and only has freshwater fish. In the beginning, when everything was very good, not only would you not have had as salty a water, so a good chance that you'd have been able to have fish completely thrive in both, but your flood is also going to produce areas of freshwater even within the global flood scenario. You can go to caves today, underwater caves, where you've got heavy salt water at the bottom, clear freshwater at the top, and they do stay separated. So you can have freshwater fish that have come down into the freshwater system, and saltwater fish which have come underneath from the sea, and they're in the same cave together because you've actually got this separation factor. So all of these things come in together into answering this objection. Any comments from you or Craig?
We spent a little time in the Chafla Basin, right? Freshwater.
We did.
Would we ask Randy?
Do you get sharks? Yeah.
And he says, yes, we get sharks. They migrate up here. Crabs,
Into the
many
swamps.
others into the swamps. You know, you're talking 100 miles from the coast or near about. It's yes, it can go on today.
Any comments?
And the ocean's getting saltier all the time.
Yes. Do we have a question on the Ask site?
Yes, we do have a question on the Ask site about that, and we also have a couple of items in the fact file if people want to look up fish and salt water and fresh water. And there are fish today that live in mixed environments. You think of river estuaries and tidal rivers where the amount of salt in the environment does change, and fish are able to cope with that. It's all a matter of which way you have little chemical pumps on the surface of the cells in their gills, which can either pump salt out or pump it in. depending on keeping the environment within the fish's body. So the gills are well designed in some fish for actually coping with changes in the salt content. And as Joseph mentioned, there are fish who throughout their life cycle change from one environment to the other. And of course, the classic example is salmon and other fish that start out their life in rivers, migrate to the sea, and then migrate back again. And so they have a built-in system for actually changing the way they keep their salt balance. So it is there, and it's quite possible that many fish have actually lost that as part of the general degradation of the environment. So they are now trapped in whichever environment fits with where their sodium pumps are, where their salt pumps are. So trapped in the salt water or the fresh water. But there are fish that can cope with changing environments these days. So there's no reason why there wouldn't have been before Noah's flood and during Noah's flood.
I believe eels are another example as well of fish that can go from one kind of water to another as well. But sorry, yes, Craig and John.
Speaking as the fisherman of the team, there are quite a few methods apart from one Diane talked about. When you have a look at catfish and things like that, that sort of are very used to going from clean water to mucky water to dirty water to salt water, etc., they actually change the constitution of a slime which is on the outside. So when they really don't like the water they're in, they actually are the gluiest fish you could actually get. They're just covered in glue, but it's actually a saltwater ion protection mechanism, which is different from the one that the fish use on their gills. So they have a gluey system that makes it harder for the salt to penetrate. There's also sharks. Having caught sharks for many years, they don't use the gill trick. They don't use the gooey trick. They actually put urine into their blood. And so hence the rule, you want to eat a shark, bleed it as soon as you catch it. Otherwise, it tastes like pee. It really does. It's terrible flavour if you forget to do that. So there's all these mechanisms which are designed to actually enable fish to go from salt water to fresh water. And we have sharks that swim 20, 30 kilometres upstream into fresh water every day. No trouble.
Good stuff. Yeah, I know my wife can testify to the shark urine taste, having tasted shark in Iceland, and I just wish I'd had a camera on her at the time. But did you have any comments, Craig, before we move on?
I think it's been done pretty well. Our fish farm that we run with the seahorses is in an estuary, and from time to time we have major floods that come down the estuary. Our river here drains about 18% of Tasmania. So when there's floods, we cop it. And there's no doubt that the sudden freshwater flush can cause the creatures some grief if we don't watch it. The sudden change is more of a problem than anything. But we do sometimes, as required, put some of our saltwater fish directly into fresh water for a short period to treat things like parasites. They don't immediately curl up and die or anything like that. You don't leave them in there for too long, but you can actually treat them for various pests and diseases, particularly on the skin, using fresh water. But our estuary does drop to half the normal salt levels of the ocean. So if ocean's about 34 parts per thousand, it drops down to sometimes 16, 17 parts per thousand, and the fish still live happily. Well, I don't know about happily, but they still live out there in the estuary, and people still come fishing, in fact.
No, great stuff. There we go. And yes, a reminder again, not only about the Ask site, which Sam has put a comment up in the chat so you can access the Ask site, but also the eventual plan with Creation Research Live, which Sam was talking about earlier, not only having it on an app format, is so that we can get it integrated into things like the Ask site so that it becomes a real powerful tool for you folks. So do get behind it, do support it, sign up to Creation Research Live on the website. The app is soon to be, so do continue to support us in that way as well, and continue to like, share, and subscribe to all of our videos that go out on YouTube. All right, Sam, time for another question. Have we got perhaps one from the live chat?
Sure. You can have one from the live chat, as you asked so
Why
nicely.
not?
Right, okay, so this one comes in from Bill Gates. Question, are there any valid reasons on why there are no steps of evolution taking place now, i.e. primates evolving into Homo sapiens, or even more ridiculous canines evolving into whales?
Assume that we were coming from the point of view of if evolution is real, or if evolution did occur, then why aren't we evolving onwards and upwards? Because you'll find that there are a number of evolutionists that claim that we are continuing to evolve. I believe that David Attenborough was one of them who mentioned the concept that we are continuing to evolve as a species. Evolution is not a static thing, I think was the quote, which is hilarious considering the fossil record is relatively static in terms of kinds after its kind. But it is an important point. Number one, why don't we see evolution taking place now? As Richard Dawkins says,
it's just occurring so slow.
Yeah, it's been observed. It just hasn't been observed while it's happening, I think was the quote. And John can correct me on that. But also, you've got to ask the question: well, are there any valid reasons why there's no steps of evolution taking place now? If it even if we can see the evidence that it is happening now, currently, again, beware of the argument of the present is the key to the past, right? Even if we did see any evidence of it happening now, that doesn't automatically mean that that's how it happened in the past. To do that, you would need to go to the fossil record, which is a history of past life. Now, is it a history of death, or is it a history of life? That's the second question you need to ask. But even if you assume it's a history of life, all you can see is that creatures have reproduced after their kind, or they've gone extinct, right? So neither of those two things are any help for evolution at all. John, Craig, Diane, comments?
Sure, I'll throw in a few comments as someone who added on to his geology degree work 3 years of genetics. And as I've said before, and I'll continue to say it, our professor was a world expert on the evolution of Drosophila melanogaster, otherwise known as the fruit fly. But when you asked him, how did evolution happen? He said, we do not know. When you asked him for evidence of it, he would simply point to flies losing their wings, flies going to red eyes. He had no evidence of anything changing into flies from non-flies, or flies turning into things that weren't flies. And he would be one of the first to admit that. But one of the things that's gone on with myself and Diane since then is the realization that you are designed to not evolve, right? I'll repeat that. You are designed to not evolve. So when you look at the mechanisms in the human body, you have repair mechanisms which are unbelievable in their sophistication. To repair DNA, to patch up mutations, they are really a whole system of engineered design mechanism to keep you human, right? To keep a monkey, to keep a fruit fly, right? And they work brilliantly. And Diane can take up where I leave off. But the interesting thing is, there's not only a physical reason for not observing evolution, there's a biblical reason that you need to consider. You see, modern science, when you go back to its origins, began with the biblical philosophy. Read Francis Bacon, read some of the others on their biblical philosophy that God has been a God of law. He's built law and order into the creation, and he's commanded us to have dominion. Let's exercise it and find out what his laws are, right? That's the whole basis of modern scientific investigation, which is why Western Christianity is the source of science, not ancient Hinduism. Totally different and wrong philosophy out there. So what you'll find is when you look at your biblical philosophy, it says also in Genesis chapter 1 through to Romans chapter 1, God has written his nature, written his signature, stamped his authority loud, and he tells you what he's like. He has put his own nature on his creation, and he never changes. That's why we know homosexuality is wrong. He was opposed to it when he made Adam and Eve. He's still opposed to it. No apologies. That is a biblical position. He has built this into creation so that you find that the fossils, as well as the living things, are designed to reflect his nature. If we were meant to be man, we will stay man because Jesus Christ is the same. Jesus Christ, the creator, never changes. Whatever he says about something 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, he has not changed his mind one bit. And you and I need to get into line with that. Diane, tell them about some of our mechanisms which are there.
Yes, well, the more that we study in modern genetics, the more we've seen evidence that DNA is designed not to evolve. In your cells all the time, your DNA is being constantly surveyed for any mistakes or any damage to it. And there is this massive repair crew, which is hundreds of molecules, of really complicated molecules, that all have to come together, work in a particular sequence, and they will actually take out damaged bits and replace them with properly copied bits. That's why we actually have two strands in DNA. It's meant to be a backup system, and when your cells reproduce, not only is the DNA copy, but it is checked at that time. And if there are any copying mistakes, they are edited out and replaced with correct pieces. Now, that system does break down in the world that we live in now because sometimes the repair processes get damaged. So it's like looking after any piece of machinery or a building or something. If you knock out the security system or the repair system, well, the damaged bits are just going to go on. And that's what happens with a lot of diseases these days, including cancer. And as we saw with that report we had about the bacteria, bacterial infections ultimately go back to a defect in one of the genes in the bacteria that starts off a whole process that results in disease in human beings. But ultimately, DNA, when it is functioning properly, is designed not to evolve. And that's what we see when we go out and observe the real world and we observe things reproducing, whether they be bacteria, plants, animals, and people. Our observations are that things multiply after their kind. And so that's why there are no signs of evolution or no steps of evolution happening now, because living things are designed not to evolve. They are designed to multiply after their kind. And that's what we observe when we actually go out and look at the real world, no matter what we believe about what may have happened in the past. What we see now is after their kind. And we do see some change, but it's degenerative change. We don't see any new things evolving. We don't see anything changing from one kind into another. A bit of variation, yes, with the fruit flies that the geneticists love so much. Yes, you get change from flat wings to crinkly wings, or red eyes to different colored eyes. But even that bacterium that we talked about in our newsletter, the disease-causing bacteria is exactly the same species as the non-disease causing ones. And they actually studied a couple of other species as well that have the same problem. And again, same species, just something has gone wrong in the genetics. So that's what we see in the real world.
The short answer to that question, therefore, is no.
Yeah. Good summary, Craig.
Sorry, okay.
I was wondering how many people, if they really believed evolution, would have children, because you never know what you're going to get, or how many plant breeders would be plant breeders because they wouldn't know what they're going to get. But
well, that's right. Well, farmers make that very point.
It's a question that should be asked to an evolutionist, see what they come up with.
And agriculture is the longest running experiment in human history. It was the first job given to man, which was to tend the garden. It's been going on for, in the archaeological record, at least 5,500 years. And plants still produce the same plants that they were producing thousands of years ago. So they don't actually evolve at all.
And with a lot of work, we can make some slight changes within those kinds, but that's all we're accomplishing. Yes.
Let's do another question.
Yes.
Okay, so let's do another question from our backlist here. This one comes in from Douglas Boffey. Does the Ark still exist on the mountains of Ararat?
There's been many expeditions that have gone up there, and by creationists. John Morris took several expeditions up there, struck by lightning and such. They didn't find it, but there's really good historical evidence and testimonies of people that have claimed in the past, not too long ago past, to have seen it. But they said that it was on the edge of a mountain, about to teeter off the end. And so is it still there?
I don't think we should commit to it. Simple as that. You can't commit to it. Does it still exist today? Well,
Who knows?
I've never been there. I'm not going to commit to it.
Yeah, does it actually matter if it even does exist today?
Yeah.
That's the same point that that Jesus made, with the account of the poor man Lazarus and the rich man. Rich man went into torment. Poor man Lazarus went into paradise with Abraham. And the whole point that Jesus was making through the account that Abraham said is that even if somebody rises from the dead, it doesn't make any difference. They've already got the law and the prophets. That's good enough evidence for them. If they're going to reject that, then it doesn't matter even if somebody rises from the dead. Now, rising from the dead is pretty powerful evidence, and people would still reject it. You know this because somebody did rise from the dead. His name was Jesus Christ, and people still reject him today. So the Ark and discovering the Ark, or whether the Ark still exists on the mountain of Ararat, isn't going to be the final proof for Christianity, as many people believe it to be, because we already have the documentation of the Ark having happened, and the global flood having happened. It's in Genesis, which is Moses and the prophets, right? We already have the evidence in front of us. Of course, that leads on to an interesting concept, because if you flip that, believing the Moses and the prophets, you get an interesting reason as to why we do what we do. John, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, just one thing you might find helpful to think through. Having spoken personally many times to John Morris and enjoyed immensely his telling and retelling of being struck by lightning many times, attacked by wild dogs and all of those sort of things, and getting very frustrated at not finding anything up on the mountain. And of course, the chief historical bit of evidence was the French archaeologist, historian, who came down with a bit of carved timber that wasn't native to the area. I read that when I was a youngster, and as far as I can see, it's still a valid bit of situation. But as to why a log of timber would be up there, shaped, etc., I've been reminded as I've traveled all around the world of the real history of the planet. Noah gets off the ark. The water is still on its way down. You may remember the water started to go down 3 months before they got off. The chief reason probably being so that the grass could grow, the animals would have fresh food as soon as they got off. And they got off and they proceed to eat it. But of course, Noah and his family have to have somewhere to live. What are they going to use? And people have almost glibly said, well, they chopped up the ark to live in. Well, that's a possibility, particularly since I've now traveled all over the planet. And you look at the history of England and Scotland, and you say, why were castles stopped? Why did they stop building them? And then the name Oliver Cromwell comes up because he brought a humongous big cannon in from Europe and proceeded to blast many of them off the planet. Well, he didn't have to blast too many of them before people just abandoned castles themselves. Castles were useful against bows and arrows, against spears, against human invasion, but against Oliver Cromwell's cannon, you may as well just walk out the front gate and give up. Now, but the castles aren't there. Where did the castles go to? And as I was in one village in Scotland, and I found the answer to that, the castle that used to be on the top of the hill is now what the village houses are made of. Right, so we've cycled and recycled. There's nothing new about recycling. Recycled castles are all all over England and Scotland, and that's most probably what happened to the timbers of the ark. In the next little while, burn them up for keeping you warm, because for the first time there was winter on the planet, right? It was winter, there was summer, you needed shade to stay in. So Noah had to solve that problem, as well as getting the animals off the ark and making sure they distributed wherever the Lord wanted them to go. So there's an interesting thought for you as you look for evidence of things around the planet.
And if people are getting struck by lightning, perhaps God's saying, I don't want you looking for it.
There could be a good point in that, because God is a God who's always been jealous of his position. And I say jealous in the best sense. That's one reason why Moses' staff is sort of gone. That's one reason why the serpent is no longer valid, because the people worship these things. They took the object instead of the God who used the object, and they would worship him. I'm sure if we found Noah's Ark outside of Kentucky, people would set it up as a religious shrine and they would start to worship.
Yeah. And we have such good evidences. Before we came online, Craig asked about one of his fossils that I have in my keeping, a dragonfly. And that one fossil alone speaks to so many evidences that we have of a global flood. I don't know if you wanted to elaborate, but there's plenty of evidences out there, and that's what we're trying to bring to people.
And I think the point that Craig made is quite an important one. God is not really in the habit of keeping ancient relics. Think Ark of Covenant, think temple, so on and so forth. He's provided us all the evidence we need in his written and revealed word, and that's all that we should be more than happy with it. We've got about 10 more minutes before we round things up. So, Sam, let's do if there are any more thank yous, but also maybe one or two more questions before we round things off for the night.
All righty. Well, I'm just grabbing the last few bits and pieces here. Right. Okay. So, got some thank yous to give out first. First one comes in, of course, from Doki Doki for 4 US Buckaroos. Shiba Dog gifting a large bone, bowing respectfully. Thank you very much. I would hang on. I can put a pen in my mouth. There you go. There you go. It's the best I can do without ripping out my femur. Right, okay. Next is from George Bond for 20 Aussie Buckaroos. Getting ready for Queensland weather. 3 days of 38 degrees Celsius, end of summer. Yeah, that sounds lovely. I'm very cold at the minute. Got a very quick question coming in from Curious Leisius or something like that. Did Joe enjoy his trip to the Ark?
I did. It was a very brief rush tour. We spent 2 days and did the museum and the Ark, and spent a lot of time with some of the guys up there, talking with them. So that was the most beneficial thing out of all of it. But yes, we did go to see it, and it's big and it's there, and it's pretty good. So yeah, we'll maybe have some more reports on it later. But yeah, it was a good thing to go and to actually see.
All right. Another question.
Very American.
well, first clue, it's in America, and second clue, it's in Kentucky.
Exactly.
So that should say it all, really, shouldn't it? Right. Okay. So we've got a question. This is an interesting question. This one I haven't I don't think we've really explored. Do the panel think that monsters young children see in nightmares may be demonic attacks?
I would certainly some yes and some no, and some of them reading the Great Grump, walking through some of the books that they read. So you've got all the above in that question there, and it'll be up to the parents to counsel the kids. And the best way of dealing with monster nightmares is to tell them they can trust Jesus in the best of times and in the worst of times. You'll find that the solution. And if demonic problems do continue, which are real, by the way, they are the minor in our Western world. And I'll give you one principle I learned from a guy who used to be the head of a coven. Basically, as Christianity advances, the demons retreat. As Christianity retreats, the demons advance. So you need to be well and truly wearing the armor of God in our modern society, where the government forces are largely departing from Christian themes, and the demons see an opportunity, particularly with the kids. Have a look at what they teach them in school. You can learn everything you like without reference to God. Science, history, religion, no reference to the real God or the real Jesus Christ. Demons see that as an opportunity. So parents, protect your kids where you can. Give them Christian input and Christian education of some sort or other. You want to add anything to that, anybody?
Just teaching them to, pray before they go to bed,
Mm-hmm.
and pray for God to be with them, protect them, but also be careful of what you invite into your home, because you do open up opportunities. And in particularly what you invite your kids to watch or read before they go to bed. So that would be
I've seen it. I've seen it firsthand where, without going into detail, a child being severely impacted by something and praying in the name of Jesus Christ, and immediately the child was restored to peace. And the name of Jesus called out in those circumstances does amazing things.
We're told in the Psalms, I think it's the Psalms, that God can provide a peace that surpasses all of our understanding. And that is a real and true blessing and promise that we have if we put our trust in Him and in Him alone.
Yes.
So,
And I think it's really important to say, if there's people out there that are having this sort of thing happening to them, you can do it somewhat to yourself, but I think go and find a local pastor that you trust, and have them pray with you, pray over the house, pray over the family, and so on, for protection. The name of Jesus in prayer is incredibly powerful.
Amen.
I would just say the question was addressed to young children, but it applies to adults.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Joe, can I make a recommendation? There's one there about the cliffs of Dover, which is probably a good way to finish off. I'm going to sneak in a commercial, one last one, about our coming conference on the 20th and 21st of April. Come along and enjoy where did the Australian Aborigines come from? How short a time have they actually been here? Why are they black? Who did they descend from? Where do they fit into the Bible? And how come they've been so resistant to so much of the gospel? All of these things, because you'll find that in the North Queensland, where I lived for quite a while, you'll find the Aborigines there would not venture into the dark forest, because that's where the demons live, since that was the last issue that just came up. So they had a great fear of darkness and no power, because they did not know the one who was light. So April 21st, here in Southeast Queensland. Keep watching creationresearch.net. A great weekend. Sam, read the question on Dover.
All right. So this one comes in from Bronze Snake. Question: what kind of biological life consists of the White Cliffs of Dover? AKA, what are the White Cliffs of Dover made from?
Okay. Well, before we go into the biological makeup, let's talk about the chemical makeup, because you'll find that the White Cliffs of Dover are 98% calcium carbonate. In other words, they are practically pure calcium carbonate, and that presents a problem if you want to try and go along with the standard definition of how things like chalk forms. Now, chalk is a form of limestone. Limestone is characterized by its calcium carbonate composition, but chalk, like the White Cliffs of Dover, tends to be a very, very pure limestone, right? Think of your white chalkboard chalk that you use to write with. Now, the standard story of chalk formation is that you have a shallow sea. The shallow sea has lots of marine life in it. The marine life, many of it is microscopic. These microscopic creatures called coccolithophores are covered in tiny little shells called coccoliths. The shells fall off, they sink down to the bottom, and over vast periods of time, they build up into calcareous ooze. The calcareous ooze, which is a fantastic term, builds up over vast periods of time until it gets compressed down into chalk. Now, again, be wary of the present is the key to the past, because we have calcareous ooze deposits today. You can go and see them, and they are not pure calcium carbonate. For one simple reason, it takes long periods of time to build up calcareous ooze. And so what you get mixed in with the calcareous ooze is things like fish poo, fish scales, gunk and grime and sediment and dirt, and it's pretty horrible, grey, boggy, nasty stuff. Okay, when you're dealing with something like the White Cliffs of Dover, which is practically pure calcium carbonate and is very pure, that's their characteristic thing, right? What it tells you is that a different process has produced the White Cliffs of Dover. Okay, what's its biological makeup? Well, it is predominantly made up of fossils, right? These tiny little coccolith shells, these tiny little shells which are made themselves of calcium carbonate, these little coccolith shells, and mixed up in the White Cliffs of Dover are lots and lots of other kinds of sea life. Giant great big ammonites, seashells, belemnites, brachiopods, bivalves, and so on and so forth, right? Sometimes even sharks get caught up in it. Now, in order to bury and preserve a great big fossil like an enormous, we're talking like 4 foot across ammonite in some cases, nearly 1.5 meters long. These kind of ammonites need to be buried very quickly. You can't have them lying around for vast periods of time. They're just going to be destroyed. Now, it was Professor Derek Ager who actually made the point about the White Cliffs of Dover. If you actually calculate the chalk formation, you get ludicrous results like 0.002 millimeters of deposition per year, according to the dates. Now, you're never going to get a fossil if those dates are correct. So, number one, yes, you have lots of biological life. We call them fossils today because they're compressed and they're fossilized. They're either turned into stone, entrapped in stone, buried in the chalk. Secondly, most of the chalk is made up of once biological material. So it tells you that something different has happened than what we have experienced today, both in the volume of sea life as well as the environment. And thirdly, the fact that you have all of this together and it's so pure tells you that something different has happened in terms of the formation rather than the standard calcareous ooze. Now, there's two potential explanations for the chalk formation. One of them is something that was proposed by a geologist called John Matthews. You'll find that the chalk is generally speaking, creation geologists agree that the chalk is one of the topmost level, the last level of sediments to be formed. So one of the suggestions is that you have a planktonic bloom at the end of a global flood, and as the land rises up out of the sea, it traps the chalk. However, there was a rather interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago because it talked about how flowing water can actually produce limestone. And it was never thought before that flowing water could produce limestone because you interpret it as a shallow sea that slowly settles down. But one of the most interesting comments from this paper was that conventional wisdom has prevented us from considering flowing water as being a key to limestone formation. Now, what is this conventional wisdom they're talking about? It's the present is the key to the past uniformitarianism millions of years. It turns out that flowing water can indeed produce calcium carbonate deposits like chalk and limestone, and so we're straight back into a global flood for sure. John, any comments?
Yes, having climbed up and down the cliffs many times and taken you there as well. You remember the fossil thorn that I found?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, so we've got fossil thorns, land plants, and we've also, one year I found a standing upright ammonite, vertically standing up. And if you're going to have all of these nice little microscopic creatures losing their shells and standing up to hold this ammonite up, it's an impossibility. So again, we get back to Derek Ager saying, if you have a slow rate, use the dates. Something's very wrong with the dates. It means it's very wrong with the mechanism. That ammonite would have fallen over and simply be lying on its side, but it wasn't. It was vertical, and the thorn was actually embedded in the things as well. And I think if I remember correctly from my collection, you probably got it over there, I found a nice big fish poo. And at a slow rate of deposition, it simply wouldn't make it down to the present. Sadly, I've got to say, they've blocked off all of that section where we did such wonderful collecting for years. Correct, Joe?
So again, sorry, missed that last bit.
They've blocked off all of that section where we had that great cliff fall.
Yes, sadly. You can't access it hardly at all anymore, which is sad. But you can still join Creation Research for field trips. We're holding our big convention this year, which we'll start to advertise next week. But there's details on our UK Creation Research website. 5 days going and digging up fossils on the Yorkshire Jurassic Coast. So even though they've blocked off that place, there's still plenty of other places to find chalk and limestone and fossils throughout the UK and indeed throughout the whole world. So good stuff. Well, we've come to an end, folks. It's now time to close and shut things down. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, we do hang on to your questions, and in a few weeks' time, we'll be back with another Q&A session. And next week, we have another topic. I believe the topic next week, I think it's is it the living fossils one, or let's have a look. We've got a topic.
It's a topic on something.
It's a topic on something. Darwin and Dawkins deceptions is our topic next week. So we will.
Well, hang on. Before we go, we need to give thanks because we've had more donations.
Oh well, over to you, Sam, to close down then.
Honestly, we can't leave the stream without giving thanks. Honestly, Doki Doki coming in with 149 US buckaroos. A purple cat. I have no cats with me, so I can't hold up a cat, unfortunately. So you have to make do with an invisible one.
I'm not sure they enjoy the process of turning them purple either.
Doki again coming in with 149 US buckaroos. A hamburger. I'd love a hamburger right now. I'm a little bit peckish. And I'm Matt coming in with 4 US buckaroos. Pair character exaggeratedly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. We had coffee at the start. We had coffee at the end. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And that's it for thanks.
I don't think it is. I think there's another one.
You're joking. Is there another? Oh, you see, Doki. What's he like? 2 US buckaroos. Hands doing a fist bump. There we go. Awesome.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right, folks. Catch us next week. We're dealing with Dawkins' deceptions and Darwin and all the like. So, or answering Dawkins and Darwin, something like that. It's all up and details are up on the YouTube channel. So do remember creationresearch.live, as well as all of our programs that we have on YouTube to like and subscribe. Sign up to the newsletters, and we will see you next week. God bless everybody. Thank you very much.
There.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.